I'm Leandra Lederman. I'm the William W. Oliver Professor of Tax Law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law in Bloomington, Indiana. And now I'll pass the mic to my co-host.
Thank you, Leandra. I'm Dr. Leopoldo Parada, lecturer in tax law at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in this new session of the Indiana Leeds Summer Tax Workshop Series. Today, we have a fantastic speaker, Professor Allison Christians, who is a Steigman Chair in Tax at McGill University in Montreal, where she teaches and writes on national, comparative, and international tax law and policy. She focuses especially on the relationship between taxation and economic development, the role of governments and non-government institutions and actors in the creation of tax policy norms, and the intersection of taxation and human rights. You can follow her on Twitter at Prof Christians and also on her website and blog, which can be found as allisonchristian.com. So today we are really glad to have Professor Allison Christians with us, and I will leave her now the floor to delight us with this fantastic presentation.
Thank you so much, Leo. That's terrific. I did put the slides on my website. If anybody wants to pop those out in a separate window so they can watch me here, you're welcome to do that. And I'm gonna, in a minute, while I pose for the video, I'm gonna share my screen. Here we go. And it's not the perfect screen share, but it'll have to do. So first of all, let me say thank you. Thank you, Leandra and Leo, for, oh, and look at that, I'm not even on the first slide. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Leandra and Leo, for inviting me to this tax summer series. I've not been to all of them, but I've been to a lot of them, and it's been really great to connect with everybody in the international community. I think one thing that's been really exciting about COVID-19 sorry, is that it has brought us all together in this really weird way. And I've noticed that we're getting a little bit better at Zooming, you know, the Zoomosphere, as I have trademarked that. That's mine now. The Zoomosphere is, we're getting better at this. The tax Zoomosphere is really buzzing. So I thank you, Leandra and Leo, for putting this together. There's a lot of organization that goes on behind the scenes, and I appreciate that. And then I also want to thank, just a little shout out to Shui and Diane. They switched places with me a couple weeks ago. I was supposed to present a couple weeks ago and I wasn't feeling well. I'm kind of on and off right now. I'm sort of okay today. And I have my good days and bad days. So for all of you who are feeling the same way, you know, I can relate, and I'm just going to power through this. But it could be, here's my caveat. It could be that I'm not thinking straight right now. That's very possible. As I was putting this PowerPoint together, I started thinking, you know, I am working through this idea. I think this is an interesting idea. I think that people would be interested in this idea, but it's more of a gathering of thoughts and an experimental, just thinking about the terms we're using. And there's a point in this discussion when I started thinking, okay, a lot of this is economics, and I am really focused on how law translates economic policy into, you know, lived policy, into lived law. So I'm not sure that everything I say in here is really going to make sense. I don't actually know. And so I want to treat this Zoom conference call workshop as a way to kind of get your feedback on how I'm thinking about this. And of course, the impetus for all of this is, you know, I see us at a crossroads, right? In one direction is multilateralism, a new global tax deal that works better for all the countries that are at the table right now, and hopefully doesn't leave anybody behind. That's one future path. And the other future path is this sort of chaotic, unilateral taxes of all different kinds, fighting about the terminology, fighting about whether one is a tariff or isn't, and what is a tariff anyway, and you know whether this is targeted at a country or a business, or is it targeted at a monopoly or a quasi-monopoly, right? So these are the questions that are animated in this discussion. And of course, some of you know that Tarcisio, who I assume is on the Zoom somewhere, Tarcisio and I have been writing about global excess profits tax, where we kind of put together a bunch of elements that are already in the system and said, well, isn't this like, this makes sense. This is like the next natural step. Just, add this as pillar 3. Also TM to pillar 3. I know the OECD is now talking about a pillar 3 and they are gonna use it to do something else. That's what they do. They take your idea, they call it the same thing, but then they do something else with it. If Richard Murphy's on the call, then he knows they did that with CBCR. This is sort of what I'm going with. This is like thinking, okay, we're struggling right now. We're at a crossroads. There's some agreement and there's a lot of discord, and there's terminology is coming at us fast and thick, and it's sort of incoherent. And we've always known that the international tax system was a little incoherent. Can we do a little bit better job? Okay, that's the preface. So what is it that creates value? So this is where I start thinking about these words that we're using and these ideas that we're using in value, because you all know on the call, everybody that's done any kind of work on international tax knows that who cares what value is, what matters is source. But source is trying to get at value. That's the very idea of it. So I put this on a spectrum here to kind of indicate we actually don't know where one begins one ends and the next one begins. And so anytime you're not sure what color you're looking at in there, is it blue, is it green, is it blue, is it purple, is it green, is it somewhere in between? That's because you're looking at surplus value, right? That is the value that you get by combining those factors. So you get firm-specific factors, and everybody knows firm-specific factors that's where value is created, like the job creators, right? It's all firm-specific, right? Well, not so fast. Yeah, there's firm-specific factors. And I put innovation, nerve, and skill. But also, that firm-specific factors include kind of some other things that we don't think are so great for society, like theft and fraud, opportunism, and dumb luck. Like, you all know that Apple stole a bunch of ideas from HP, and all the companies steal from each other, and the Facebook stole from the Winklevis, and of course Microsoft stole from everybody and continues to do so. So we know that this is part of firm-specific factors, is the ability to engage in theft and not be stopped. So we know that, and we consider it sort of a firm-specific factor, but actually it's a location-specific factor too, right? Because if a government doesn't stop you from stealing something, then that's a failure of regulation, and that's a location-specific factor. Regulation, right? So look at location-specific factors. What creates value? Well, it's clear we can all imagine, like natural resources, and I would include human resources in there. I'm just trying to minimize the words on the slide for reasons you're going to see pretty soon. So humans and natural resources, we just, we get it. It's like sort of a Lockean, no, not Lockean, a Locke, John Locke, that guy, yeah, Lockean thing, or no, the other guy, no, it doesn't matter. The idea that you're entitled to the fruits of your labor, right? That guy, who's that? Is that Locke? I don't know. Anyway, you get the idea. So the natural resource, is it Locke? Thank you, good. I was thinking, yeah, it is. It's the second treatise on government, isn't it? Yeah, that's it. That's where it is. Okay, so natural resources, we know they create value, and so we're not surprised when countries try to tax those things. But we also know that market regulation creates a tremendous amount of value. I'm not just talking about infrastructure and roads to get the stuff to market. I'm talking about the idea of law. I'm talking about the idea of property ownership. Who can own, and what rights do they have when they create things, and what do they get away with in terms of theft and fraud, and like how do they benefit when the opportunity comes along or dumb luck happens to fall on them, and also how do we protect them when the dumb luck that happens to fall on them is bad luck, right? So all of that is market regulation, and those are location-specific factors that create value for firms. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and so then I started thinking, okay, now I'm not an economist. Do economists have a word for what happens when shock creates value? Like, what's their word? And I was reaching for words. Is it windfalls? Is it, is there some kind of like, and, I'm reading my economics textbooks, and maybe there's people on the call that can say better things about this. But here's the idea. the shock actually can create value for firms. We've seen it, right? We're seeing it. We're engaged in creating value for a firm right now, being in the Zoomosphere. So consumer adjustment is the shock is the trigger, but the thing that creates value is that consumers adjust their behavior, right? Including they panic, like buying toilet paper in massive quantities, right? But also it triggers government response, and government response, it looks a little bit like market regulation, but it's different, isn't it? It could be money. They're just pouring money into people's hands, and it could be protecting people from price gouging, or it could be all kinds of different regulations that are immediate and maybe not very well thought through. And you know what happens when governments, do things in a very quickly without thinking it through too much. Well, look at all on the left, all those firms start going, ooh, opportunity, dumb luck. Let me take advantage of this. And so governments are sort of scrambling, but it's not really location specific. It's kind of like seismic, all over the world specific. So what's going on with these words, and like, how do we think about what's going on in international tax? Well, I was thinking, okay, we can get a little bit more granular, right? So I just put these boxes on here. I'm sure you could add others, but just to quickly look at them. And firm-specific factors, everybody is sort of accustomed to the idea that ideas create value, for sure, like massive amounts of value, maybe the most value. And yeah, effort, labor, puts forth an effort, strain, sweating, like working, like what I'm doing right now, just really working hard to, express an idea. That's hard work, and that creates value, I hope. Well, we'll see. I hope to be creating value rather than destroying it with these words that I'm providing, this effort that I'm providing right now. And then, of course, private wealth, right? Like dumb luck is having money given to you or available to you, your endowment or whatever, so that you can actually put those ideas and effort into motion. Because if you have ideas and you put all kinds of effort, but you don't have dumb luck, you're not going to be able to get those things to create profit for you or value for you, right? So then moving into the middle, I put these in the middle, and I'm intentionally putting them across the categories, right? So I'm visually trying to show that we actually don't know what produces these things. So IP rights. Is it an idea? Yes. Is it a natural resource? Yeah, in the sense that a person could be a natural resource. Is it market regulation? You bet it is. And is there opportunism and dumb luck? Of course. Who's the first one to get there, or how do they, cleverly or luckily get their idea in before somebody else, or figure out something before somebody else? Could be dumb luck. But so that's IP rights is the one I think that we have a lot of contestation about in the international field, obviously. This is why, because we don't really actually know what creates that value. We know that markets have something to do with that, but I want to look at the inverse of that. It's right below. It says respect IP and corporate form. Have you ever thought about how it's not just the granting of the right that creates value? It's the respecting of the right somebody else gave that creates value. So the fact that you're actually not allowed to just break somebody's copyright or patent basically anywhere in the world, and when you are, then the firm that has the patent can't get rent from it, right? So that means that when a government respects a corporate form somewhere else, and when a government respects IP somewhere else, that act of respect is itself value creating. Without it, you don't create value. So I see that as, I push it deeper into market regulation, and some of it is dumb luck. But we have examples of this, with pharma having patent on AIDS treatment, and India and Brazil saying we're not going to acknowledge those patents. That's a lack of respect that shows you that when you do have respect, that's what's creating value. And then you can just kind of fill in across the board, right? Labor, a consumer market, a capital market, users, networks, land, water, minerals. And then on the shock side, I'm just sort of filling these in out of my brain, which is like, okay, surprise, we all need to use Zoom now. So Zoom is something that we're all creating value for because we surprisingly need it. And then there's an irrational exuberance, and I'm thinking about mortgage-backed securities from the 2008 crisis, it created a shock. The irrational exuberance built and built and built until boom, right? And then, well, what about like the surprise breakout of Facebook? Is that a shock? I mean, do you think Mark Zuckerberg, when he was creating Facebook, was like, I am going to control the entire universe and I will control all political systems everywhere in approximately 12.5 years? No, he didn't. He thought he was building something for Harvard so his friends and he could creepily creep on girls. I mean, it was a shock and a surprise breakout. So I don't think that we have really quite figured out where the value of Facebook comes from. But why isn't it just shocking and surprising and unexpected that it created that? And then, hoarding, TP, I mean, their toilet paper, that's just like a result of shock. People are doing these things that they didn't do before. And that's what I'm talking about with panic. And then lockdown, the restaurants are all closed, and the bailout and the stimulus. These are all things that create value or destroy it, right? I mean, lockdown destroys value for restaurants, but it creates value for Uber Eats, right? So that's the kind of packaging of what creates value. Then I'm going to try to tie this up to the international tax. And here's this messy slide. Like normally, I would do, all these transitions, but I can't do that on Zoom. So here they are. Like, what do we see in the international tax arena? Well, the green check marks are, we're pretty confident when countries try to tax those things that they're in the right. We've decided, we've got it. Like we've got a word for it, source or residence or, resource rent tax or, we've got all kinds of words for these things and we fit them into our system. And so we have a way to tax them. And marks are the things we have vocabulary for, language for, and laws for. And I think basically if you tax these things, no one's going to raise an eyebrow or start charging you. Okay, so what we know is that if you tax one of those things with the green checkbox, you're not likely going to get the US writing you a letter and threatening you with sanctions. Okay, that's pretty basic, like minimal, like, right? It's pretty clear if you try to tax IP rights or labor or land, water, minerals, or your capital markets, maybe a little bit of wealth, or the various translations of those into income, probably the US is not going to write you a letter. But what about these ones with the red boxes? Check those out, right? The idea that you would tax any part of income because you associate it with the value created by respecting IP or respecting the corporate form, you're probably getting a letter from the US Treasury. If you try to tax your consumer market, the value that your consumer market creates, you might get a letter. If you try to tax the users and the networks that you think are creating value for a firm, you're definitely you already got a letter in some cases, right? And then of course in the shock, we don't know how to deal with any of those value creators, so there's not much there. And then I put a check mark on ideas and effort because they flow through into the things we recognize as income. And I put a, sort of on private wealth, okay? And then the breakouts, right? The hence. So, to the extent we think we don't do a good job of taxing private wealth, you see the NGO pressure to do that. And I don't think there's too many people saying, well, you can't do that. International tax says you can't do that. Maybe that will come along, but so far so good. And then you see this idea of the fact that we allow IP rights to drive where income is created, and the fact that we don't give anything to the other countries that cooperate in that, that's, I think, the impetus for BEPS, and especially for GILTI. So for sure, when the US applies GILTI, they're thinking, well, we don't actually know if we fully do respect what's going on with the application of a value stream based on IP rights. We don't know if we do respect that. And so, maybe we're going to sort of not respect it. But somehow the US has a hard time seeing that the taxation of value associated with users, networks, or the consumer market is exactly the same principle. It's the exact same idea, right? So of course, when people start saying, well, we should really tax the value that's created because the consumer market is a combination of market regulation and natural resources in our country that these foreign firms are coming to get, of course, you're going to get a pillar one. The fact is that you're always going to have that problem because countries have a sense that they are helping create value and they're not being able to tax some of it away as their endowment. And if they can't tax some of it away as their endowment, then they're losing all of the attendant benefits from that foreign investment. So of course you're going to see this pressure. And then when the OECD is slowing down and you start to see digital services taxes and substantial economic presence, that's because countries are saying, well, what about these users that we are providing in these networks? These are natural resources combined with our market regulation that we as a country are providing. This is part of our endowment. You can't just come in here and take it and think that we don't get any of it. Why would we let you in that case? Why are we cooperating? Why are we respecting you if you come in here and take and never give back? So of course there's going to be pressure. You're going to see DSTs and SCPs. And then finally the shock, the pandemic shock shows us, well, there's all this other stuff that, like, you know, just all of a sudden, surprise, shows up in our economy, is creating value. And that's why you're starting to see people start raising the idea of excess profits taxes again. And in particular, Tarsis, you and I talking about global excess profits tax. So does tax align? No, it doesn't. And it doesn't align because we don't always know where the value is created and which party created it. There's surplus cooperation, and we're confused, and we don't have language for all that because we built all this stuff 100 years ago, and we didn't have language for a lot of this stuff. So we're still working with that same language. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide. You tell me if you see it. Here we go. Now it says, oops, it says what is normal, what is abnormal. You got it? Okay. So now I'm just going to connect this up. I'm going to try to connect this up to the economics language and talk about what I think is happening with Pillar 1 and why all of this is a piece throughout, right? So when economists talk about, you know, income, and they're thinking about, well, where, you know, how do we know where it's, what produces it? They don't just talk about normal and abnormal. They also seem to have this risk-free idea. I don't know, maybe that green circle should be more overlapping of the blue. Maybe it should include more of that. We could quarrel about that. But here's the basic idea. At the lowest of return to risk is this government bond rate. You know, you're not going to invest in a company that's going to give you less than the government bond rate, because you should just invest in the government bond rate. So depending on where you are, which country you are, and what the government bond rate looks like, that tells you something about what normal profits you're going to expect when you invest in a company. Right? We have this risk-free rate. Then you go into this idea of like, well, what is normal? And somewhere in this area of normal, we don't know where it starts and we don't know where it stops. But somewhere in there is this idea that, well, there's something like the average corporate bond rate. Investors are going to require at least that. And then there's this idea, well, no, they're going to require that plus a little bit more. What's the little bit more? Well, how much could they get if they invested in the next company over? So this next best alternatives idea comes into the literature to try to explain that when you're thinking about value, you need to have more than just the basic, right? You need more than average corporate bond rate before you're going to invest. And then you start moving up, okay, into abnormal. And you'll see the diagram is like, well, I'm not really sure when normal ends and when abnormal begins. But when it begins, we're starting to talk about economic profit. Now, economic profit is everything kind of above normal. But I've separated it out here a little bit. So this isn't perfect. You know, this visual is kind of still a work in progress. But here's the idea. Economic profit includes this idea of quasi-rent and might also include this idea of true economic rent, or it might not, depends on who you talk to. The economists are not all on the same page on this. But quasi-rent is this. It's like you're gonna make this money because you're in this field, and it's not necessarily because of something shocking that happened or something dumb, like dumb regulation, or, you know, it's not like pure rent seeking. It's more like, you know, you're in the field doing something at the right place in the right time, and you're able to get some more than normally would have to. You're able to get that just by virtue of being there and doing the work you're doing. But you have to put in effort, and you have to have a skill, and, you know, you have to have resources and all that stuff. So it's not pure or true economic rent. So here's the insight. Economists don't want us to tax that. They don't want us to tax quasi-rent, because if you tax quasi-rent, you're going to get less investment. But what they do want us to tax, and they say it's okay and good and wonderful and beautiful to tax, is everything above that. You can tax as much true economic rent as you want. You can tax it theoretically at 100%. Why? Because it's in effect a windfall. Not really, not quite, but it's in effect, you know, it's above the quasi-rent. It's partially due to dumb luck or opportunity, and it's non-distortion. If you tax that, you're not going to distort anything, because everybody's already moving into your investment at maximum to get that quasi-rent. and everything else is just a bonus, so you can tax it away. So the trick is you've got to figure out how to start taxing true economic rent without touching quasi-rent. And so that's why there's like a mix there, and we don't know where to draw the line to make sure we're on the right side of that. And I can see in the discussion about digital services taxes, about global excess profit taxes, about wealth taxes, about, well, and I understand wealth are individual, not corporate, but as they go through the corporate form, capital. All of this discussion is really a fight about, well, when are you taxing economic rent, quasi-rent? We don't want that. That's going to depress investment, and you're going to kill the economy, and you're going to hurt, you're punishing success. And when are you taxing true economic rent, which is not punishing success, because true economic rent is not a result of effort, it's a result of chance. And so taxing it is not distorting it. So there's a lot of, hand wringing and line drawing and imperfect, trying to balance around that, around those two categories. And then finally you get this windfall, which I've just sort of thrown off the chart in, glorious abandon. Where is it? It just fell out of the sky. You guys know that windfall, it's about like, you can't cut down a branch, but if the branch falls down on you, then you can pick it up and go take it to the market and sell it. And that's why they call it a windfall. That's the pandemic, right? You didn't ask for it. Nobody wants this. This isn't great. It's terrible. But some people are going to pick that branch up from the pandemic and go sell it, and they are selling it, and they're making a windfall. And guess what? They're going to do that all because they get all of those returns up to the windfall. They don't need the extra windfall profits. They don't need them to do the thing, to pick up the branch and go. They don't need to do that, to do the things that they're doing to make money in the pandemic. So we should tax that all away. We should tax it all away any way we can, because they're not going to change their behavior in order to keep that profit. This is the economist's view, I say. Okay, so then I'm just gonna, you see the little boxes now that say routine and non-routine? Yeah, good. So then I'm just gonna connect this up to the OECD Pillar 1 scenario, right? So what is going on? They're starting to talk about routine and non-routine, and you see them using the words normal and abnormal in some cases, and people are talking about, what is the risk-free rate and what is the above risk rate, and all. You see these words getting bandied around in this discussion about what should we do about the taxes of certain firms that seem to be off the charts in terms of how much profit they're making. And I would argue that we've drawn a line somewhere, and some people are worried we've drawn it right down through quasi-rent. Some people are really worried about that, and so they're pushing back. And some people are worried, well, you're probably taxing true economic rent, but guess what? It's not your rent, it's my rent. It's not the rent of Europe, it's the rent of the US. I want it. You don't get to tax it, it's mine. And I am not indifferent to that tax, because it's not whether it gets taxed or not. The taxpayer doesn't care, but I care as a government because it's my endowment or somebody else's endowment. And so this line is starting to get drawn somewhere, and wherever it gets drawn, there's going to be some unhappiness and discord. But the question is not whether the line gets drawn in the wrong place for firms. The firms might be indifferent if you manage to stay above quasi-rent. You just leave quasi-rent out of it. You get that line further along so that it's just hitting the windfall or the true economic rent. Maybe the firms are indifferent, but governments are not. They're not indifferent because they have to share that. They have to share that endowment. All right, so this is where my thinking has brought me so far. It tells me that, when you ask, well, the idea here is we're supposed to tax income where value is created and business activities take place. Well, value is created in all kinds of surplus profit type of ways, where more than one interested party contributing to the bottom line. And business activities occur wherever the law says they occur in some cases. And that's the problem. That is a problem, that we respect those ideas. We respect those categories. And that's got us to this place where we're trying to figure out what to do about all this stuff. So how can we accurately count? You see my little slide that says we can't in the middle? How can we accurately count value in the international tax system? Sorry, we can't. We can't. So should we give up? No, right? Maybe we can do a little bit better than we did before, because we're in a moment. We're in a constitutional moment. If you talk to Steve Dean, who's on the call, we're in a existential shift. Yeah, we're in an existential shift. If you ask Ruth Mason, who's, I think I saw her face in the call, right? So maybe we can do better, maybe a bit better than we did before. Steve Dean talks about a moment of reckoning in his paper on the constitutional moment, and I think that's right. That's right. We're at a moment of reckoning. Now, COVID, he wrote the paper before COVID-19 hit, and he's, I think, adjusting it to take this into account. So I think we'll hear from him eventually. But COVID-19, I think, plus the digital tax disagreement creates a moment of reckoning. It's exposing all these fault lines, inconsistencies, and weaknesses. It's a moment where we can actually see there's political will to change, and now's our time, tax lawyers. It's our turn. We have to take all these concepts that the economists have laid out, and they're confusing, and they're interesting, and they're not always straightforward, and they don't all agree with each other, but this is our moment to say these are all the piece. The piece that we're trying to reckon with is that actually you can't separate value. You can't take something that is the product of multiple inputs and then accurately count it out. So therefore, it's a political decision. It's a political decision that actually meaningfully impacts everyone on the planet, right? And so it's going to matter. The thing that's going to matter the most is not where's value created and not what is an excess profit or a surplus profit or an abnormal or whatever super profit. It's not that, but where is it? It's all that's going to matter is who's at the table to decide when that thing gets divvied up. So hopefully we're not going to squander this moment. As I said, I thank everybody who came here to sit here and listen to me sort of rant my way through this and rave my way through this. Thanks to Leandra and Leo. Thanks to IU and Leeds. Everyone in the Zoomosphere, TM. And again, you can connect to me on Twitter or on my website. And now I'm ready to take those questions. And I know I really appreciate it. It's been great. It's been a lot of fun hanging out.